Investors now weighing the change in Finance Ministers Indonesia as its markets stabilised after Finance Minister Sri Mulyani came out to vow that she would relook the government's policies following violent protests. The Indonesian rupiah strengthening against the greenback following the shock cabinet reshuffle, which removed Sri Mulyani Indrawati. More on what her removal could mean for Southeast Asia's largest economy, CNA's Roland Lim spoke to Trinh Nguyen, she's senior economist, emerging Asia from Natixis.
She had to take the difficult decision of obviously afford this lunch program, but at the same time cut public works and many programs, which were very difficult because Indonesia essentially, despite the fact that growth is about 5%, is running a very tight fiscal policy, while at the same time the private sector is not doing so well. So as a result, I do think that the big question for markets without her is that how are we going to balance between the two? Aggressive growth driven by fiscal policies and programs, at the same time fiscal consolidation.
Does that in any way change your House view for another, say, 50 basis point cut? I mean, that takes the policy rate to 4.5%. How does that square with the easing of the new burden sharing that the government wants with higher rates for government deposits without actually stoking inflation or undermining monetary independence?
I do think it depends on whether or not the Fed will cut aggressively. That would put less pressure. Obviously, the Fed rate is at 4.5, Indonesia's 5. If it cuts without the Fed cutting aggressively, that would be a huge problem. If the dollar softens, that eases the pressure because the differentials are not going to be too wide. It is an issue in that Indonesia, beyond just interest rate differentials, the key argument for investing in Indonesia is really that its debt load is rather low as a share of GDP, and that the government for the past decade or so has worked really hard to keep this debt low and the deficit quite low. And as a result, if you look at the expansion of government debt across the region and across the world, Indonesia did not follow that path, right? So as a result, I do think that this reshuffling of the cabinet will need to be watched very carefully because that has huge implications of one of the key positive metrics of Indonesia, which is its relatively low debt load.
What's your current estimate of the funding needs for Prabowo's flagship programs, particularly for the school meals and the village cooperatives? I mean, what's likely to be the shortfall?
Well, first, there are two different things. One, first, the school meals is roughly 1.5, 1.6% of GDP. So that has to be funded, right? So when that gets expanded, you have to think about the fact that we suddenly have going from 0 to 1.5% of GDP in funding. That translates to the widening of the fiscal deficit if we don't raise taxes. And if we don't raise taxes, we have to cut spending. So this is an issue. The second issue is that the productivity of such programs, the implementation so far, given the fact that it hasn't been entirely rolled out nationwide, it's been quite complicated. So I think that that's a challenge for investors looking at this program. While feeding students is really necessary, at the same time, the question is it going to be productivity enhancing? And how many years do we have to wait while the debt load is rising? Meanwhile, we're cutting a lot of programs that's productivity induced, right? For example, infrastructure, public works, and so on and so forth. So that's the big question mark for investors, the reshuffling of the spending. The second one is obviously there's another one that the cooperative, as you said, the village cooperative, that doesn't go under the fiscal spending program. It goes under what he wants to do is essentially more centralization of Indonesia. Post the Asian financial crisis, Indonesia underwent decentralization. The decentralization has weakened the government, meaning that currently Indonesia generates only about 10% of GDP in tax revenue. That limits its ability to spend, as I mentioned earlier. So what he's trying to do is by expanding this cooperative, in order to that, you need funding, and he wants to fund it via the state banks, right? And it's quite large. So big question mark, will that lead to higher productivity enhancing, or is it going to lead to banks, state banks, adding more non-performing assets to their book. That's a big question mark. So for investors, they have big question marks because there are big changes that Prabowo is proposing. He's changing in terms of how he slices dice and the budget. At the same time, he's also changing the allocation of the banks, right? And thirdly, allocation of state assets. All these changes now, in the short term, it was being anchored by the fact that we still have that finance minister who's trying to kind of prioritize these different programs and keep it in check.